Hello, nerds of the universe, and welcome to Nerd Talk. A little while ago, I did a video on why I think JFK was not a good president, and how he is one of the most overrated presidents in American history. But who is the most underrated president in American history? Allow me to introduce you to Rutherford B Hayes. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Who the heck is Rutherford B Hayes? And yes, as far as presidents go, he is one of the least known in history, down there with Chester Alan Arthur and Zachary Taylor. But even among historians, he's ranked laughably low. According to C-SPAN, they rank him as the 12th worst president in American history. That's super low. But then again, they also have Woodrow Wilson as the 13th best, so maybe they aren't the most accurate source to base this off. But even among YouTube historians, who, funny side note, I have actually found are a lot more fair and well-educated than C-SPAN historians. But even they rank Rutherford very harshly.
So we are on to Rutherford B Hayes. I think I'm going to put Hayes at D. They called him Rutherford for a reason.
Rutherford B Hayes. I think Rutherford also goes here to D tier.
To enter the office because of a political compromise. So I am going to make him C tier.
But why? Why do they rank him this way? Well, if there's one thing that people know about Rutherford B Hayes, it's that under his presidency, Reconstruction came to an end, and segregation started to take hold in the South through Jim Crow laws. Now, of course, that sounds terrible, but it's a bit of a loaded statement that doesn't give you the full story. Because if you look at Rutherford Hayes' life, it doesn't make sense that he would want something like this. He was an abolitionist his whole life, worked on the Underground Railroad, fought for the Union in the Civil War, and was a member of the Radical Republican Party. And he was a huge supporter of equal rights for former slaves while he was governor of Ohio, and implemented the 15th Amendment before the federal government did. So let's dive into exactly what happened. To begin the story, we have to turn the calendar back to the year 1868. Ulysses S. Grant was just elected the 18th President of the United States, and was put there to be harder on the South in terms of civil rights than his predecessor, Andrew Johnson. And he certainly was. Throughout his administration, federal troops were sent into the South to force them to give equality to former slaves. African Americans were finally put into positions of power and government, some being elected while others being appointed by Ulysses S. Grant himself. All of this was going well and good until 1873. You see, everything comes at a cost, and the bill to Ulysses S. Grant was due. Because of all the money he was spending on federal programs to help African Americans and the inflation that followed the Civil War, all the resources and troops he was sending into the South to force them to comply came at a huge cost to the economy. The USA fell into the largest recession at that point in American history. At the time, it was called the Great Depression, or the Panic of '73. Today we call it the Long Depression. Suddenly, the North, that originally supported federal troops in the South, were a lot less enthusiastic, as now they were feeling the economic pinch of the Depression that was a result. There were protests in both the North and the South demanding that troops be removed for the sake of the economy. Ulysses S. Grant refused to do this. On top of this, approaching the election of 1876, the election that Rutherford B. Hayes would go on to win, the South was once again threatening civil war. Rutherford Hayes had not campaigned on removing troops from the South, and most likely had no intention of doing so. But as the ballots were being counted, the margin between Hayes and his opponent, Samuel Tilden, was becoming thinner by the hour. Ultimately, it came down to 3 states: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. If Hayes could win these 3 states, he would win the presidency. However, the votes in these 3 states, particularly Louisiana, were contested. The Republican Party claimed that in these 3 states, as well as many states in the South, violent Democrats were stopping Black Americans and white Republicans from voting, and had they been allowed to vote, Hayes would have won all 3 contested states. The Democrats, of course, denied this, and the 2 parties were caught in a deadlock. Eventually, Congress decided to set up a special committee to vote on who should get the contested votes. 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. That independent was Supreme Court Justice David Davis. However, Davis disqualified himself after Samuel Tilden's corrupt nephew, Colonel William T. Pelton, attempted to bribe him and buy his vote. So Congress replaced David Davis with a Republican, Joseph P. Bradley, making Hayes the winner by just 1 vote. The Democrats, seeing that Hayes was going to win, delayed the electoral votes and continued to filibuster the decision, which threatened to leave the country in another deadlock. So the 2 parties came together to make a bargain, and they came up with what is now known as the Compromise of 1877, in which the Southern Democrats would concede the election to Hayes if he withdrew federal troops from the South. Hayes was hesitant, as he detested the idea of a, quote, white man's government. So he said he would withdraw troops from the South if voting rights for black Americans would be secured, and the deal was agreed upon. Many people use this to suggest that Hayes stole the election, given the fact that through the popular vote, Tilden got a majority. But that simply is not the case. You see, Rutherford Hayes had nothing to do with the election process to begin with. Heck, he wasn't even the one asking for a recount. It was his party. His only role in the election at all was him accepting the deal that the Southern Democrats put forward. Which brings me to my next point. The Southern Democrats and the Republicans made a deal that they both agreed to. Hayes didn't steal anything, it was a bargain made by two willing participants that agreed on the terms. So Rutherford B Hayes didn't obtain the presidency through any corrupt or illegal activity, and he wasn't in charge of who was on the committee to decide which candidate got the contested votes. All of that was done by Congress. He was simply the beneficiary. But then many asked the question, why did Rutherford Hayes agree to the deal in the first place? If he was so passionate about civil rights, why would he agree to remove troops from the South? Well, the way he saw it was this. If Samuel Tilden won the election, not only would troops be removed, but African American rights would not be fought for or secured by the federal government. But if Hayes agreed to this deal, though he would have to remove troops from the South, he could still fight for African American suffrage and civil rights. So either way, troops were going to be leaving the South and Reconstruction would come to an end. There was nothing he could do to stop it. But he thought that, at least with him as president, he could still continue to champion civil rights. But even on top of all of that, I still think it was a good thing to remove troops from the South. The American economy was on the breaking point, and the South was once again threatening civil war, which, due to the US economy, we could not afford. So removing troops from the South allowed for the USA to stay out of another bloody civil war and help focus on rebuilding the economy. So really, Hayes made the best of the situation he was given, though it was not ideal. But again, that's just talking about the election itself. What did Hayes actually do as president? Well, first and foremost, let's look at the economy. As I said in my video on John F. Kennedy, there are three areas to grade a president on: economic policy, social and domestic policy, and foreign policy. In terms of economic policy, how did Rutherford Hayes deal with the Panic of 1873? Well, by the end of his presidency, not only had the economy completely recovered, it was actually doing better economically than it was before the Panic of 73. But how did he do it? Well, remember when I said that the reason for the economic downturn was because of the resources that were being poured into the South to protect civil rights? Well, that was partially the reason, but not the whole reason. You see, during the Civil War, spending went up by 4,000%, which is, yeah, a lot, I know. And wouldn't you know, the government couldn't pay it back. So they did that thing that you're never supposed to do, but everyone does anyway. They printed more money and paid the debt off in greenbacks that were worthless because they effectively got America off of the gold standard, which knocked gold out of circulation. And without the gold standard, the US dollar was worth way less. So Hayes, through the 1875 Specie Resumption Act, carefully built up the government's gold supply to redeem the greenbacks. And so that by December of 1878, greenbacks circulated at a face value in gold. After Hayes successfully returned America to the gold standard, the economy not only recovered, but was prosperous again. It was one of, if not the fastest economic recovery in American history. In fact, political scientist Mark Zachary Taylor, which, by the way, is such a funny coincidence given the fact that Zachary Taylor was the 12th president. Anyway, Mark Zachary Taylor spent years collecting data on how the US economy has performed over the years. He decided to take that data and see if it showed how the president historically affected the economy. And in first place, Rutherford B Hayes was tied with FDR, Warren Harding, and William McKinley. Now, if I'm being honest, the McKinley one doesn't initially surprise me, as the McKinley tariff that he implemented was extremely effective in bolstering the US economy. But with the Harding ranking, I was actually surprised by it until I did more research. And it turns out that though Harding was a two-timing, whore-grinding, trust-buying, corporate-lying sleazebag, he actually created the basis for the Coolidge economy and was effective at working with Congress to quickly recover from the Wilson recession following World War I. So that's pretty interesting. You still suck, Harding, but now you suck a little less. You're welcome. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that Hayes was successful economically, so let's move on to foreign policy. In foreign policy, Hayes was mostly non-interventionalist, but where he did intervene, he was mostly successful. Through a joint effort with Mexico, he successfully put down a group of outlaws committing mass theft and murder, who would illegally cross the border into America, rob and kill, and then return to Mexico. thinking that they would be outside of American jurisdiction. Red Dead Redemption 2 vibes, by the way.
I had a goddamn plan!
Though Hayes initially ordered troops to cross the border to catch these criminals if they had to, after the joint effort with Mexico was successful, he revoked that order, and relations with Mexico improved. Hayes also faced a problem with Chinese immigration, as racism in California caused hardships for the Chinese immigrants. Their 14th Amendment rights were also being violated, and the courts stepped in on the side of the Chinese. However, the people of California complained to Congress, who designed a bill that would limit immigration from China to the states to 15 immigrants a boat. This violated the 1868 Burlingame Treaty with China that allowed for unrestricted immigration. When the bill passed in Congress, Hayes vetoed it, despite knowing it would make him increasingly unpopular. But by the end of his presidency, he was able to make an agreement with China and Congress that allowed regulation on Chinese immigration, but made it illegal to prohibit Chinese immigration. However, there were some failures. Hayes failed to secure the Panama Canal for American interests. But aside from that, his foreign policy was quite effective. Now, where Hayes really shines for me personally was with social and domestic policies. From the previous section, we already mentioned how when Chinese immigrants faced hardship, he refused to prohibit immigration from China. Base. But he was also involved in very progressive legislation that is seldom talked about. For example, in 1879, he signed an act that allowed female lawyers to argue cases to the Supreme Court. He's also helped root out corruption in the Republican Party, which made him increasingly unpopular among his own party. His biggest move was depoliticizing civil service reform, as corrupt politicians used it to line their own pockets. He also depoliticized the New York Customs House, which funneled money to the political candidates of their choice. When the Democrats took over Congress in 1878 and attempted to disenfranchise African Americans by stopping federal troops from guarding voting booths, Hayes vetoed every one of those bills that came to his desk. And since the Democrats didn't have enough for a 2/3 majority, he was successful for the rest of his term. And Hayes' treatment of Native Americans was also very progressive. Although he was against the preservation of Native American culture and favored assimilation, the federal government did appropriate several $1 million to Native Americans as penance for them being evicted from their homelands many years ago. The government also allowed the Ponca tribes to return to their homeland. Hayes' alliance with the IRA, or Indian Rights Association, marked the end of the Manifest Destiny. So yeah, that's why I think Hayes is the most underrated president in American history. Is there anyone you think is more underrated? Leave a comment down below if you do. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like this content. Follow me on Instagram, join my Discord, links will be in the description, and I'll see you nerds in the next video. Nerd out.